A dab of it was suddenly smeared across Brianna's nose, giving the late-hand pause as she took in the now rather overwhelming scent of the gooey mix that was being liberally applied over her bald skin. She could have asked what exactly it was, but her mind was a little addled from the sudden rush to her senses, and she only thought to try and discern the makeup on her own. Honey. There was definitely honey in it, and some various spices that she couldn't quite place, but didn't detect anything particularly exotic about them. And something else, something stronger than any of the other scents. One she knew, but for some reason just couldn't place. The rabbit girl's pause for pondering left Cat to get her rather well coated in the shiny mix for the next few minutes. Yes, her body reflexively twitched and jerked about both from the temperature of the sauce and the occasional tickle that the bristles gave, especially in more sensitive spots like the rabbit's purr and erect nibbles. But at least she wasn't deliberately trying to pull away, nor was she bothering him with any more pointless questions. Brianna barely noticed the drop in temperature across her body as she was coated in the cold mess, not noticing the sticky sensation all throughout her skin. She was too busy inhaling deeply and trying to place that last scent, the one that occasionally eluded her mind's grasp. She even licked up at her nose trying to taste it, but the blend of the other flavors diluted it too far for her to place the lone mystery. At least, whatever the whole of it was, it tasted alright. Then she squealed in response to a sudden tickle between her legs, and she knew exactly what it was. What she still didn't understand was why she was tied up, completely bald, and being coated in a sticky mess of honey, spices, and female rabbit's sexual juices. She opened her mouth to ask, but she was interrupted before a single syllable came forth. Sorry I didn't have time to get your own juices out of the sauce. I would have thought to do it in bed, but I was so lost in the moment, and it was so yummy I couldn't help but lap them up. But these juices should be good. Came from a bunny girl about your age, and I've been keeping it fresh. Cat paused momentarily, remembering that girl. An insatiable lass provided him with enough sauce mix to last for some time, even considering what he used on her in the end. He started salivating as he fondly recalled the final night he had spent with her, but he was pulled back to reality by Brianna's confusion. What girl about my age? Why did you smear this stuff on me? What are you doing? Cat ignored the question. He learned not to bother wasting time going into detailed explanations. They rarely fully believed it at first, and the truth would be apparent sooner or later without any explanation up front anyway. He simply continued mushing. Pity. I ran out of James sauce. Might have been nice to season you with the flavor of your own cousin. Brianna paused, completely at a loss as to how to respond to that. She waited for Cat to explain further, and when he kept his silence for nearly a minute while he finished coating her skin with that sticky sauce, she finally worked up the nerve to, very quietly, ask, What do you mean, James? You didn't know, James? Cat grinned, and it was becoming apparent, though the strange twist of the feline smile, that he wasn't entirely sane. In fact, he might not be sane at all. He was definitely showing clear signs of outright madness. The feline asked, James, white rabbit, only child, 17 years old when he disappeared? I guess I could have met another James who was just like your missing cousin, but I doubt it. Her heart was pounding now, and her whole body trembled from fear. She thought of her current situation, and while she didn't consciously comprehend the danger to herself, she did realize the implications that this feline had met James were not good for her cousin. In a quiet whimpering and almost begging voice, she asked, Why didn't you say you'd seen him? When did you see him? How long ago? Do you know where he went? Cat was finished with the sauce and was quite pleased to see that there was enough left over for at least another night. He sealed up the bowl to keep it fresh and answered, I never told you because you never asked. And I last saw him right here in this kitchen, about 5 weeks ago. Had him turning over a fire for a few hours, then ate him in this middle of the room. Got lots of cum from him beforehand though. Used it all up already though. Cat sighed sadly. 3 weeks earlier he got the idea that the young rabbit male spunk would be delightfully compliment for the flesh of a squirrel girl, not even out of her teens. Turns out he was right, but he used all of James' legacy in determining as much. Brianna lay there, utterly shocked by what she'd heard. Part of her didn't want to accept, but her current position, naked, stripped off fur, sex stuffed with some strange substance, body coat with a stick honey-based mix, slowly convinced her that this cat's words, horribly and besides they might be, were truth. He'd cooked and eaten James. He was a monster. He ate people. And then it finally dawned upon her. She was about to be his next meal. Part of her mind knew that this was going toward a terrible, horrible end. Being stripped of fur should have been the tip off right away. But her mind didn't want to accept that her feline lover, strange as he might be, was actually a murderer. There was no denying it now, though. She'd calmly, well, relatively, letting this cat stuff and prepare her to be cooked. He was going to eat her. Her reaction was fairly typical, if a bit delayed. Once it started, Cat wondered what the hell had taken her so long. The sobbing, the screaming for help, the pitiful begging, the futile strugglings within true check bindings. Those were somewhat amusing, actually, as her movements jostled around the stuffing inside of her, which led to even more involuntary squirming. Though one of her tear-filled attempts to plead for her life, the rabbit's voice was drowned out by the loud creaking of metal against metal. Brian instinctively turned her head towards the source of the noise and saw, horrified, the opening up of the feline's large oven door. The lapland's terrified sobs didn't actually double in intensity until after the wave of heat washed over her. Her large, tear-streaked eyes watched the feline return to her. She again tried begging and pleading, shaking her head and whining, "No! No!" and "I'll give you anything! I'll do anything!" Her attempts reached the peak as she felt intense heat against the back of her head. She was at the entrance of the oven, about to be pushed in head first. She'd been so afraid or horrified. I think it's supposed to say she'd never been so afraid or horrified in her life as she stared up the psychotic feline, still begging for her life. It wasn't any more moving than the struggles, sobs and pleading from anyone else the feline had put in there, or who he had skewered and cooked in his fire pit, or strapped to his grill, or dropped into his fryer vat, or boiled in his stew pot, or he'd cooked a lot of people. He'd not once been convinced to let someone out of his kitchen after making up his mind to eat them, and poor Brianna was no exception. Brianna tried to wail with all her might as she was pushed into the oven, but the intense heat took her breath right away. It also forced her to close her eyes. It was far too uncomfortable to keep them open for any amount of time in this intense heat. There was, of course, a large struggle, but it was more reflexive and instinctive than any deliberate plan of action. People being cooked alive at over 400 degrees Fahrenheit typically aren't that sharp when it comes to devising elaborate escape plans, especially if they couldn't pull one off before being exposed to such intense heat. It was more of a random tug where you feel the most heat in a futile attempt to break away from it, shifting from one part of the body to the next. None of the attempts ever getting anywhere, with exhaustion and fatigue setting in typically no more than 5 minutes. By then consciousness was mostly faded anyway, at least in most cases, and Brianna was no exception here. Her movements died down as the skin turned a bright red color, and her already labored breathing soon faded out as she lacked the strength to pull any more of the scalding air into her lungs. Cat did what he always did after getting another sentient being over a fire in an oven or otherwise cooked. He watched, waited, and masturbated. Not to orgasm, of course. Orgasm would wait until the meal was ready, so he could probably enjoy his release and his dinner at the same time. It was always a difficult time for the feline. He was impatient and impulsive, but also insistent upon having his meals probably cooked. The rare occasions where he had 2 people in his kitchen were nice because he could keep one around for pleasure as the meal roasted, baked, boiled, or whatever. But on most nights when he was to dine on sentient flesh, he had to wait out in the long hours alone. It was enough to drive him insane, if he weren't already. Knowing that there was really nothing to do but wait, the feline pulled up a chair and watched Brianna's progress through the small window set in the oven door. Brianna didn't expect she'd have the best sexual experience of her life, the most horrifying experience of her life, and finally joining up with her cousin all in the same night. But here she was, having experienced the first 2 already, and only hours away from ending up in the same feline stomach that had digested James weeks earlier. No longer moving at all, she simply lay peacefully in the baking pan, turning a deeper and deeper red until her body began darkening even further to a deep, rich brown color. Her skin dried out from the intense heat, but the glazing that coated her hardened and prevented the moisture from escaping anywhere. So it was trapped at the surface, making her glisten in a tantalizing fashion. Inside her sexual passage, the stuffing packed within her absorbed more of her juices. Both the sexual juices leaked out earlier and the juices of the cooked flesh, and began expanding, filling up more space within her until it began rinsing up to the opening of her vagina. Periodically, the oven door would open and a pair of fork prongs would place another set of dimples into her left and right thigh as the feline chef who waited to eat her tasted the flesh. Each time those prongs sank in deeper and deeper. Hours ago, Brianna wouldn't have screamed from being pierced in the leg with a fork. Now she simply sizzled and steamed, and she would have done that without being poked. Hours passed. The worst was long over for Brianna, and they were quite torturous for Cat, who couldn't tear his eyes off the intensely erotic sight of his lapine lover slowly cooking to perfection. The stuffing packed inside of her had long since begun spilling out of her sex, piling up a bit between her juicy thighs. Another check, another probing with a fork, and this time it sank down until the pointed tips tapped bone. Clear juices leaked out freely from the 2 newest holes. Cat nearly had an orgasm right there. Brianna, the rabbit who had squirmed with delight as the feline's tongue had worked its magic over her clit, was done. It was time to eat her. Cat gazed admiringly over at his lovers one more time. Even without the fur, even with her skin a crisp brown, even with her body glistening from the mix of her juices and a sauce applied earlier, the feline still recognized the steaming roast before him as the beautiful woman who had held him so lovingly hours earlier. She was lying on the table now, in the same position she'd been in while cooking in the oven. Cat recalled how beautiful she was as she had slept in his bed, yet he still felt that her current placement and positioning was a far more attractive sight. Her limbs had pretty much cooked into position, and so the ropes that had bound her ankles and wrists were gone. For all his impatience, as much as he wanted to sink his teeth into her flesh, Cat was at a loss as to where to begin. Everything looked so good. Juices slipped down her plump breast, and thick streams of steam rose from her nipples like little tea kettles. Her feet had plenty of inviting tender meat, and Cat always enjoyed sucking toes up to the bone. Each of her long legs had very well-toned flesh on it. Her thighs promised many hearty bites of meat before the bone would even be exposed. Her belly flesh would make a lovely steak, and who could resist the cute little adornment of her navel at the center of the cut of the meat? And then there was her sex. Her cunt, her pussy, the juiciest, most tender, tastiest portion of meat on a female. At least Cat thought so. And he'd eaten a good number of females, so he should know. Her labia lips had been stretched open from the expanding contents inside of her, with steam wafting invitingly from it, carrying with it the absolutely intoxicating scent of her cooked sex flesh. Juices dribbled down from the opening of her cunt, splashing down on the pile of stuffing that had spilled out of her. Still more stuffing, likely even better saturated with her juices, could be seen within, a hint of the virtual feast that was Brianna's vagina. Cat stuck a spoon into the pile of spilled stuffing and sampled it as he considered his first course of roast rabbit girl. It was nearly too much. Cat recognized the taste of Brianna's sexual juices, and the merging of them with the juice of her meat packed into the now moist stuffing nearly drove him to tear right into her crotch. But that wouldn't be right. She deserved better. She deserved to be loved. He ate another heavy spoonful of stuffing, then another. His breathing was already ragged and labored, but he kept eating it. The taste spiked his hunger with further arousal. He brought another spoonful up and looked at it. It was inside of her. It had cooked within her, absorbed her essence. He was already eating her, part of her, in eating the stuffing. And he wanted to eat more of her. And he wanted to eat her in a way that had meaning. He wanted to make love to her one last time, just as he had done before. He climbed up onto the table, knelt before his roasted lover, placed his nose right on the toes, and inhaled deeply. A kiss, a nibble on the toe, teeth lightly tickling the flesh, then sinking in and sucking the digit away completely. One by one, Cat devoured her toes. He slid his mouth over them, bit down at the base to loosen the flesh, then sucked it away from the bone. A slow, thorough chewing, then he swallowed and moved to the next, leaving only bony remnants sticking out from her foot in his wake. A firm lick, pressed against the sole of her foot, lips suckling against the juicy crisp skin, teeth pushing up and tearing away the juicy flesh. He sank his teeth fully into the thick flesh of her large rabbit foot, pulling out a strip of meat and exposing the bones beneath. Cat had a particular fetish for rabbit feet, and he felt his loins arching with needs as he tore more and more of the juicy flesh of her foot away, gulping down mouthful after mouthful until only loosely hanging collection of bones remained. A series of light kisses at her calf. The feline mouth opened up over the thick flesh, and teeth pressed in firmly as he stripped out the meat. Even her lower legs were nicely fleshed, and it took several bites before he could reveal bone in any single spot as he worked his way up along the steaming limb. It was too much to eat all at once, but the lower leg was well pockmarked by the time he reached the knee. A firm nuzzling at her thigh, followed by another tongue tickling. His lower teeth sank into the tender flesh, then his upper teeth bit in as well. Cat pulled out a thick hunk of Brianna's thigh. He chewed, swallowed, and went back for seconds. The meat was just slightly more tender than her calf had been, but well more than twice as thick. He ate out long strips of fine meat and still saw no sign of the bone beneath the flesh. He couldn't bring himself to stop and eat it all, however. The scent was too powerful. Her scent, the scent of her arousal, now cooked to perfection. The scent was driving him insane, stronger and stronger. His nose brushed her sex and he inhaled, utterly overpowered by it. A feline tongue grazed a moist female rabbit's sex. Cat tasted tangy sexual fluid soaking the crisp cooked labial lips as he simply lapped at them. His tongue simply tickled over the hot and steaming slit of his lapine lover without pressing in any deeper. Brianna couldn't guide him this time. Cat was on his own to make this love-making session perfect, and he knew exactly how to do it. He pushed his feline muscle into her stretched sexual opening, his tongue extending to lap at the stuffing inside, pulling more than he expected into his mouth, devouring all that he could reach. He drew back and opened his mouth up, pressing his lip on her vulva. His upper teeth were poised just below the puffy nubbin of her clit. He sank in, tearing into the tender meat, pulling the flesh of her outer sex into his mouth. He again nearly orgasmed as he tasted the mix of intimate meat and juices hitting his tongue all at once, but he forced himself to chew slowly so that none of Brianna's exquisite flavor would be wasted, and then he swallowed. He felt the hot flesh that had been Brianna's cunt sliding down his throat and warming his stomach. After only the briefest of pauses, he slapped up her clitoris, sucking on it alone, playing with it against his tongue before chewing up the little knob of flesh and swallowing it with the rest. Then he opened up again, sank his teeth into the next layer of her vagina, and began chewing. Layer by layer, the ravenous feline slowly devoured his lover's genital flesh, eventually tasting her juices along with the meat as he pulled in the stuffing with subsequent bites. His heart pounded from the excitement, his face fur dripped with her juices, his nostrils flared from the scent, and his tongue kept working to pull more and more of that meat into his mouth, until finally, after many minutes of eating yet another nearly enough time for the cat, his teeth scraped pelvic bone. It was over. Brian's love tongue was no more. Cat very slowly lifted himself up, still shaking, and licked what he could from his face. He'd made quite a mess, but there was still so much more to eat. Still hungry as he was, Cat had another, more urgent matter to attend. Cat caressed his lover's cheek. Brian's mouth remained open from a final attempt at a gasp, and Cat thought she'd hardly mind giving him one last act of pleasure, especially after the show of tenderness and affection from his previous course. He straddled her head, turned so that he could look over the remains of her body, and slowly lowered his cock into a steaming muzzle. She was hot, almost painfully hot. But Cat had experienced worse, and she had cooled to the point where there was no risk of injury. She couldn't suck properly anymore, but she didn't need to do that anyway. The warmth of her body, the grease slickening her tongue and mouth and throat, the scent of her meat in Cat's nostrils, those were enough to satisfy the feline's arousal. Cat leaned forward to nibble lightly at Brian's left wrist, while his cock pushed its way into the rabbit's steaming throat. As he felt a sudden spike in his pleasure, he took a firm bite out of the arm, then ripped out a strip of meat, when his hips began pounding fiercely. The feline braced himself, building up a good rhythm. Rhythm, it says, slapping each finger off of the bone one by one, as he let himself work up properly. After snagging upon all 5 digits, Cat let himself let go, shuddering and spazzing atop his roasted lover, filling her throat with his seed as he tore away meat from the palm of her hand. It was late. Cat wasn't sure how late, but he was relatively certain that he'd be witnessing sunrise if he went back upstairs. Not that he wanted to venture out there. He was far too comfortable on his kitchen table, cuddling against his golden brown lover, feeling himself drift off to sleep. He had eaten her right breast. It was soft, fatty, with a pudding-like texture. Some people might not have found it appetizing. For Cat, it was an acquired taste, and he wouldn't miss it for the world. For him, licking over the erect stiff nibble, then opening wide and eating the flesh on which it rested was not an experience to skip. It may not have been as intense as throwing his head between her legs, munching until he hit bone, but it was still an intimate way for him to be closer to his lover. Now he was full. There was still plenty of meat to eat in the morning. He'd probably eat her upper breast and carve a steak from her belly, for starters. For now, he was going to rest and sleep off tonight's portion. He leaned in and kissed his slave-hand lover on the cheek, then sucked away meat until part of her skull was exposed. He drifted off to sleep, lightly nibbling on her neck. Literally.